Okay, so let's get started. Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Good day, everyone. I'm David Bolduc, Executive Director of Green Marine, and welcome to our Virtual GreenTech web series. I'm very pleased to see so many of you joining us today. We had a lot of registrations, more than I expected, actually. I'm, of course, very disappointed about the cancellation of our conference, which would have been taking place right now in Montreal. But as you all know very well, a pandemic happened. Since this was our 13th conference, I was expecting a bit of bad luck to happen, but you know, this is definitely way over the top. Anyway, our team is resilient and creative, and we quickly decided to move the event online so that we could continue our mission to share best practices, new technologies, and talk about how to make our industry greener and cleaner. The response from our speakers was absolutely great. Many of them volunteered immediately to take part in this webinar series. So thank you very much for that. And I'm also extremely grateful about the incredible show of support from our sponsors. 15 of them decided to maintain their sponsorship despite the conference cancellation. I really was not expecting that. It made me realize how important Green Marine is for so many companies in our industry, and it gave me a lot of hope for the future. Even though there are tough times ahead, I'm confident that our commitment to environmental sustainability will stay strong. So thank you to all of our sponsors, and a very, very special thank to our gold sponsors, FedNav, Groupe des Gagnés, the two St. Lawrence Sewer Corporations, and Can4Now. So now, before I give the floor to our speakers, let's review how this webinar will work. So we have 4 speakers. Each will do a 15-minute presentation. After the 4 presentations, there will be a 30-minute question period. However, you can ask questions anytime using the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen on the toolbar. All microphones will be on mute. We don't want to have any background noise. Please note also that the chat box is disabled. We'll be monitoring your questions the entire time. I might choose 1 or 2 after each presentation, but otherwise I'll keep most of the questions for the Q&A at the end. At any time during the webinar, if you have a question for the Green Marine team, you can use the Q&A box and ask your question. Since GreenTech was supposed to be in Montreal, our intention was to have a bilingual conference with simultaneous translation. This is, of course, not happening in the current format. My apology to our French-speaking friends. Alors, désolé, chers amis, mais je vous promets qu'on va se reprendre en 2022 pour notre conférence qui va être de retour à Montréal. So let's get started with this session on whale protection and conservation measures, which will highlight the crucial role that our industry has to play to protect marine mammals. Our first speaker is Orla Robinson, who's been working with the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority since 2013 as program manager for the ECHO program. She has over 20 years of experience in environmental management, and she will share with us today candid perspectives, practical advice, and lessons learned over the last 5 years in a case study that demonstrates how working in collaboration with partners and advisors can create meaningful voluntary change. So Orla, you have the virtual floor.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Green Marine, for making it possible to present virtually today. I have to say I would rather be in Montreal right now, but nonetheless, very much appreciate being here, and good morning or afternoon, everyone else on the webinar. So today I'm going to give you a brief overview of what the ECHO program is, how it came about. I'm going to highlight a few of the collaborative projects and initiatives that the program has successfully worked on over the last number of years. And then, as David noted, I'm going to share some reflections with you on what I believe some of the key ingredients for a successful voluntary collaboration are. So first slide, please. There are a number of factors that led to the development of the ECHO program. The Vancouver Fraser Port Authority is the federal body responsible for the stewardship of the Port of Vancouver. And we're mandated to facilitate Canada's trade, but we're also mandated to do that in a way that's protective of the environment and the communities in which we operate. In the late 2000s, Canada released a recovery strategy and designated critical habitat for the endangered southern resident killer whale population. The map that you see shows the critical habitat for southern residents in blue on the Canadian side and in green on the US side. And it also shows the international shipping lanes, which are the primary routes for vessels calling the Port of Vancouver and some of the US ports, and they directly overlap. Through Canada's recovery strategy, as well as a number of workshops led by WWF in Vancouver in 2012 and 13, the Port Authority learned that the southern residents, who now, I should add, just have 73 individuals remaining in their population, use sound to find food, to communicate and to navigate, and that underwater noise from ships can affect their behavior and their ability to hear. We also know that the human population for both the Vancouver area and the Puget Sound area to the south is projected to grow by about 2 million by 2040. And with that growth will come increased need for goods and trade and transportation. And so it's anticipated that traffic of all kinds, from shipping to ferries to recreational vessels, will increase in this area in the coming decades. Next slide, please. So recognizing that the effects of commercial vessel activities on at-risk whales is a complex issue, and it's a cumulative issue, and it's a regional issue that requires collaborative solutions. In 2014, we formed the ECHO program. And so the ECHO program brings together individuals and organizations from the transportation sector, Indigenous individuals, environmental groups, scientists, technical experts, government agencies from both sides of the border. And with an initial emphasis on reducing acoustic and physical threats to the southern resident killer whales, over the last 5 years, we have been advancing our efforts in a number of key ways. Focusing on building the collaborative relationships, advancing research to answer key questions, testing and implementing a range of threat reduction initiatives, and in parallel, developing educational materials and tools for those mariners who are out on the water. Next slide, please. So I'm going to highlight just a few of the many collaborative projects and initiatives that we've been advancing with our partners here to fill data gaps and answer key questions that were posed to us by our advisory working group in the next few slides. So next slide, please. And one of the first questions that we were asked was, how do different vessels sound? So starting with an underwater listening station in the Strait of Georgia in 2016, which we installed in partnership with Transport Canada, Jasco Applied Sciences, and Ocean Networks Canada. We worked with some of the regional vessel operators, such as BC Ferries, some tug operators, with the coast pilots, to take their vessels over the listening station. And as a consequence of this listening station, as well as a couple of other shorter term installations that we've had in Harrow Strait and Boundary Pass, we now have ship noise measurements for greater than 10,000 vessel transits. So as well as 4 years worth of ambient noise measurements and marine mammal detections. The ship noise data that we have has been able to provide, to regional operators and other vessel owners, has often been a catalyst in helping those companies to advance their thinking around the issue of underwater noise, specifically in relation to their own vessels. And that ship noise data is also forming the foundation of a detailed vessel noise correlation analysis which the ECHO program and partners has advanced in this past year to determine which ship features and operational aspects are driving the quieter and the louder vessels. This important study and its report became available on our ECHO website just in the last week, and we hope that this study will be another catalyst in helping to inform and drive quiet ship design. Next slide, please. In 2016, we began exploring what kind of operational measures might reduce vessel noise and be feasible to implement from an operational perspective. We focused on areas of high use for the southern resident killer whales and times of the year when they're typically present in their highest numbers. Working with our advisory working group and a vessel operating committee, in 2017, we advanced our first seasonal slowdown trial in Harrow Strait. That's number 1 that you see on the map, to see if slowing vessels down made the vessels themselves quieter and made it quieter in the area which they were going through. And due to the positive results from that trial, every summer since then, we've been asking vessels to participate. And since 2017, almost 3,500 ships have voluntarily slowed down through this area. Working from the principles of adaptive management, we take our learnings each year and we've adapted the parameters each year to try and find the balance between increasing participation rates and maximizing noise reductions. Just as an example, in 2019, we actually doubled the distance, the slowdown distance, by adding boundary pass. We managed to maintain a strong participation rate of 82%. We achieved an ambient noise reduction of around 3 dB, which represents a 50% reduction in sound intensity in that area. And finally, the modeling that we have undertaken predicts that this would reduce the amount of time that killer whale foraging is impacted by about 20%. So we're currently in the process of waiting for the killer whales to come back in for this season before we kick off another slowdown for the 2020 season. The second operational measure that we trialed in 2018 was moving vessels further away from an area important to the killer whales to make it quieter in there, in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. That's number 2. And the results indicated that the greatest acoustic benefit was achieved from moving tugs out of the inshore area. So we saw between a 4 and a 7 dB reduction recorded at the hydrophone receiver there when individual tugs displaced. And so again, based on those learnings in 2019, and again this year, we're focusing efforts on just moving the tugs in the inshore area. And so that trial kicked off on June 1st. And finally, working with our many partners on both sides of the border, and I would note at a particularly challenging time due to the COVID-19 impacts, we are still planning to move ahead with a brand new slowdown research trial in the Swiftsure Bank area, number 3. Which is another key foraging area for the killer whales. And the start date is being finalized right now, but anticipated that the trial will take place sometime between early August and the end of October, focusing on Canadian and US outbound vessels through that area. Next slide, please. So as well as the seasonal operational efforts in 2018, we also partnered with Oceanwise and Prince Rupert Port Authority to develop an alert system that broadcasts the details of whale presence, specifically to large commercial vessels. Many different industry and research partners inputted to the development of the system, which is called the Whale Report Alert System, or RAS. And many mariners on the water, including ferry and tug operators and pilots and whale watchers, regularly support the app by reporting their whale sightings in real time, which is critical to its success. So to date, we have just under 300 approved users of the app from 45 different marine organizations on both sides of the border. And we really hope that these real-time alerts will better enable vessels to take action, such as slowing down or altering their course to reduce the risk of collision and disturbance to the whales right throughout the year, outside of the other seasonal measures. Next slide, please. The final collaborative initiative that I wanted to highlight is a Species at Risk Act Section 11 Conservation Agreement, which came into being in 2019. So with an eye to formalizing the role of the ECHO program and the continued collaboration of our marine transportation industry partners in the voluntary measures, over a longer term horizon, last May, the Port Authority and 6 marine transportation industry partners entered into a conservation agreement with the Government of Canada over a 5-year term. As the first of its kind in Canada, and with a focus on continuing work with our many different ECHO program advisors and partners on those existing voluntary efforts, as well as implementing new voluntary reduction measures, this agreement represents an important precedent and a potential model for other voluntary conservation efforts across the country. Next slide, please. So finally, as we're now halfway through our 6th year of the ECHO program, I thought I'd share some reflections on what some of those key ingredients to its success, I believe, have been to date. Next slide, please. So the first key element, which I believe is a necessary ingredient for a successful collaborative program, is of course adequate resources. Putting a dedicated team in place to convene partners, to advance research projects, to coordinate threat reduction measures, requires a variety of different resources in the form of dollars funding and of course in-kind contributions. And we're very grateful for the generous funding that we've had over the years from the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, from marine industry and the federal government. And we're also very grateful for the considerable in-kind resources that all of our advisors and project partners and program participants have dedicated to the program in terms of their time, advice, as well as their own resources, things like equipment and staff and data over the years. I should note that there is not one member of our advisory working group who has left the ECHO program table over the last 5.5 years. And I think the importance of that commitment and that dedication can't be understated. Next slide, please. The second element that I believe is important for successful collaboration is time. So engaging advisors and partners early and often is very important for building mutual understanding, respect, and trust, and that takes time. Advancing research to fill those knowledge gaps early on also takes time, but is really key for allowing informed discussions to take place. And of course, it takes time to test some of these solutions and measures and adapt. But the results and findings of those tests, I believe, allow for much better evidence-based decision-making in the long term. So, you know, in a nutshell, I believe going slow and taking time early on allows you to move faster and on much more solid footing in the longer term. Next slide, please. And so, as I just noted, the collaborative model takes time and probably takes longer, but I think it builds well-informed partners and enduring relationships and better long-term solutions. And with a clear understanding of the issues and you know, engaged and informed advisors and partners, definitely comes a shared sense of responsibility, and in particular, a shared sense of urgency to address the conservation needs, for example, of this high priority species like the southern resident killer whales. I believe the ECHO program is a really great example of how those small and difficult conversations that we started with our partners in 2014, supported by good science and informed dialogue and high levels of engagement since then, can really lead to boots on the ground voluntary efforts, which result in meaningful, positive conservation impacts. And I'm grateful for the support of everyone in that respect. And I think my next slide is just a thank you slide, and I'll wrap it there.
Okay, thank you so much, Orla. I'm always very impressed to hear about what the Port of Vancouver has accomplished with the ECHO project. I think this is clearly one of the world-leading initiatives on underwater noise. I said at the beginning that we would have a question period at the end. This is the first webinar that we're organizing, so we are learning as we go. I believe that if I wait until the end, we'll have the list of questions will be maybe too long. So I'll go immediately with a couple of questions that we have in the Q&A. So Orla, we have a question from Jos Leclerc. Is there, from the Port of Quebec, is there a technical way to put a device on whales in order to send real-time information on their positions to the vessel onboard system? This would potentially make the program more efficient instead of the existing static slowdown zones.
That is a wonderful idea, and I really, really wish we could do that. And we've given it lots of thought, but the short answer is no. Both on the US and the Canadian side, tagging of the animals is not allowed. There is some sort of short-term tag work that NOAA and DFO undertake through their research permitting activities, but the short answer is no, we cannot tag the animals in that way.
Another question we have from Captain Jerome Pereira. Is there a way for ships' navigation officers to detect the presence of a tagged whale on their radars?
Again, not with a tagged whale. However, the RAS system, which I mentioned, the alert system, does allow for, if a captain has that app activated on a device on the bridge, if there is a whale detected within 10 nautical miles of that vessel, a notification will be pushed to that device to let the captain know where the detection came from, and they can see that on the map and with a GPS location through the text alert that they receive. But that is currently based on human sightings reporting in where the whales are. The next phase of that would be other detection methods of the whales, so hydrophone potentially, or infrared cameras potentially, or gliders potentially in the future that may be also feeding in to that system to let folks know where the whales are.
Okay, thanks. We also have a COVID question. Do you anticipate a high participation rate this year despite the pandemic?
I don't think anyone has a crystal ball with a very clear view on what this year is going to look like. But what I can say is we have very strong commitment from the associations that we work with closely and their members. And we have had great response so far from the individual shipping companies letting us know that they intend to participate where they can. So we're hopeful, but we also, it is a strange year that I think none of us could have anticipated. So we're just pleased that we are proceeding with these measures at all this summer. So fingers crossed.
Okay, the next question is interesting. How do you ensure the whale sighting app isn't used by charter or private vessels to find whales for viewing, bringing more vessel traffic to the whales, thereby increasing impact?
That's a great question. And we had a small working group, as I noted, with industry folks and researchers working to develop the app at the time with us and Oceanwise. And that was a really important point to folks, was that we did not want to create a mechanism for people to locate the whales and go and hang out near them. So it is a subscription app. You have to register and subscribe, and you're approved based on your affiliation to an organization or a commercial entity, and so it is not open to the general public. It is a registered. You have to register officially to receive a functioning app.
Okay. A question from Daniel Cote de Gagny. Do you think you have enough hydrophones to allow adequate mapping of sound and noise impact?
I'm not sure we could ever have enough hydrophones to do that in a completely comprehensive way. But I believe that in this region we do have quite a lot of strategically placed hydrophones coupled with a well-calibrated regional acoustic model, which really gives us a very good sense of what's going on in terms of the soundscape throughout the year, and particularly for the kinds of measures that we put in place, we absolutely want to have hydrophones in those key areas to understand what the benefit of our specific measures are. And so from that perspective, yes, we do have hydrophones located in the right places to be able to measure the efficacy of these measures.
Thank you. And now a question from Howard Buslam, Transport Canada. Are Indigenous groups involved in this initiative?
Yeah, so we've had a number of Indigenous individuals on our advisory working group from the outset. We also, outside of the sort of core advisory group, are working with a number of different First Nations communities on specific projects as project partners to measure soundscape in their particular areas, and also looking at partnering this summer in the Swiftsure area to gather data on marine mammals in that area. So through a combination of kind of project partnerships and input at the advisory working group level, yes, we do have Indigenous input and advice, which is great.
Okay, so the list of questions is getting longer and longer as we go. So I'll pick maybe one last question and then we'll proceed. It's a question on the cell phones. So those that are being used on ships are not the same apparently as those being used on land. So is there a question of the app working at sea?
That's a good question. So we know from some regional operators, ferry operators, for example, that you know, from a policy perspective within different organizations, you know, they can't actually utilize cell phones on the bridge. And so in parallel to the sort of cellular app, we have also created a desktop version, which is a version that kind of works from the ops center, if you like, for you know, a particular organization. So if you can't use the cell phone on your bridge, or you don't have cellular reception, it doesn't work, there is also a sort of desk-based version where you can look at the sightings on the map in real time as well.
Okay, I said that was the last question. I'll ask one other, because it's a transboundary issue, and I think it's part of our topics today. So the question is from Rice Campbell. Can Orla mention or describe the sister program being developed in Washington State following the success of ECHO?
Yeah, I have been working to support that sister program as it develops. I'm probably not the best person to speak to the specific details of it, but many of the individuals who are part of the committee working to develop that program are also members of the ECHO Program Advisory Working Group or Vessel Operators Committee. So we kind of touch base with those individuals on a very regular basis. And, you know, we're very excited that something similar is being developed, and very supportive of that, and have offered whatever we can in terms of our knowledge and assistance in getting that off the ground. And I think also really keen to make sure that we're not kind of reinventing any wheels, and that we are able to share all of the valuable data that we can and work together collaboratively. I mentioned, for example, the Swiftsure bank slowdown, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, in those areas, in those transboundary areas where we have both Canadian and US vessels. We're already working very closely with those folks. So I see, you know, the the collaboration is already there, and I think it will just get stronger.
Okay, thank you very much, Orla, for your clear answers. Something that you can do during the rest of the webinar, you can also respond, you can answer the questions yourself using the Q&A.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Okay, let's move on. Our next speaker is Leslie James, Manager of Environment for BC Ferries, which is the largest ferry operator in North America. Leslie has over 15 years of experience in the marine and science fields, and today she will talk about BC Ferries' unique approach to help at-risk whales in British Columbia in its collaboration with researchers to mitigate impacts on the southern resident killer whale population. You have the mic, Leslie.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much. First of all, I need to apologize for how horribly lit I am. My camera has been functioning perfectly fine for the past 2.5 months, and today it decided that I needed to be the album cover of an 80s alternative music band. So I do apologize. I'm not gonna break out in song of like Bohemian Rhapsody or something from The Cure or Depeche Mode. So I'm really sorry about this. Anyways, next slide, please. So I am here today just to sort of provide an overview of where we're at in BC Ferries and sort of how, talked a little bit about the journey we've taken, as well as some of the projects underway and some of the key learnings that we've had. Next slide, please. So as a stakeholder in the Salish Sea, BC Ferries have, we feel that we have a responsibility to understand and to make efforts to mitigate the impacts on the marine environment. So BC Ferries has taken sort of a unique approach to help at-risk whales in BC, using synergies between industry and between researchers to help decrease costs and increase effectiveness and efficiencies by using existing platforms and resources. So for us, we're a ferry operator. We're not a researcher, but we do feel like we have a responsibility, and we wanted to contribute to mitigate the efforts on at-risk whales, such as the iconic and endangered southern resident killer whale population that we have off the west coast. So this presentation is going to kind of go over the benefits of the collaborative approach and sort of speak to some of our more notable projects. And I'm hoping that this will inspire other industry members to reach out to researchers, to reach out to regulators, to further these kind of collaborative initiatives. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about BC Ferries. We are, as David said, one of the largest ferry operators in the world. We began our operations with 2 vessels, and we had 200 employees. So we've evolved quite a bit in the last 60 years. It's quite something. Next slide, please. So one of the reasons that we have become so involved with the southern resident efforts for recovery in particular is because we actually have 5 of our routes operate in southern resident critical whale habitat. So in peak season, we can have up to 28 sailings per day with these routes. So we felt that it was important for us to be part of the solution, not just part of the problem. And that's where these collaboratives, the sort of collaboration really comes in. Next slide, please. So collaboration is not a new thing for BC Ferries. I've been with BC Ferries for 7 years, but we've actually been doing this kind of work for over 20. And to date, we have undertaken projects with academic institutions, NGOs, industry partners, as well as regulators. And we've got a total of about 15 collaborative projects, and I should say that not all of these projects are specific to at-risk cetaceans, but they are linked overall to BC Ferries' commitment to environmental sustainability as a whole. Next slide, please. So these are just sort of a snapshot of the the projects that we've done just in the last 2 years. Now, I'm only going to speak to the whales in our waters, and I'm going to speak to the thermal imaging cameras a little bit. Whoops, sorry about that. And you'll notice that we have an asterisk by the marine mammal surveys. This project has been deferred due to COVID. So initially, we had a plan that we were going to be having ocean-wise marine mammal observers on our bridge, and they were going to be going back and forth with our vessels. But due to social distancing measures that need to be taken, we're not allowing any non-BC Ferries people onto our bridges at this time. So next slide, please. So this project, this is Whales in Our Waters. This is an online tutorial. This was a collaborative project between Port of Vancouver, Oceanwise, and BC Ferries. It was actually inspired by one of our senior masters by the name of Captain Jan Brackhausen. And to date, we have over 100 different organizations who've initiated and have gone through the tutorial. We have a real wide variety of participants. So there are members of the general public, but as far as organizations go, we have other ferry operators. Washington State Ferries has a huge uptake in this. I believe that they have made it as a part of their mandatory training as well. BC Ferries has for all of our bridge teams. We have members from 3 levels of government, both in Canada and the US. We have port authorities who've been involved, members of the media have taken it. We have First Nations, nonprofits, the pilots, as well as academic institutions. We're expecting to update the content probably next year, and the plan is for this to be going basically in perpetuity. We want to keep educating mariners, we want to keep educating the public. The Port of Vancouver has been gracious enough to host this, so it is accessible to the public, and anybody can take it, and it is a free tutorial. Next slide, please. So this project is a very exciting project that we were able to participate in and be a part of. It's a project with Woods Hole Institute out of Massachusetts, the University of Erlangen, I'm saying it's in German, I'm so sorry, I can't pronounce it very well. And there's support from Transport Canada on this, and BC Ferries provided funds in kind. And we actually have these cameras at one of our ferry terminals on Galliano Island off of Sturdy's Bay. So there you can see a sort of a picture of what it looks like. This installation was done in June of 2019. The purpose was to trial and evaluate a commercially viable thermal imaging-based marine detection system for the detection of marine mammals. Specifically in this case, they were interested in whether or not it was going to be able to pick up southern resident killer whales. And it was to determine the feasibility of the system for real-time marine mammal detection in British Columbia waters. So one of the biggest challenges we have on the West Coast is once winter comes, we have a lot of moisture. So there was a lot of discussion as to whether or not this was actually that these cameras would survive the winter here, and whether or not they would, if they did survive, would they actually be successful in detecting anything at all? And they were very successful. So the next step for this would be for a 3D stabilizer for the infrared cameras for deployment on vessels. And the development is currently underway. They were hoping to trial it in May and June of this year, but due to, again, COVID and there's restrictions on international travel, it's likely that this is going to be deferred until 2021. So next slide, please. So you can see here, they are a little bit behind in the data analysis, so they have this chunk here from June to November 2019, but you can see they were successful in quite a few detections. Next slide, please. And then here you have the detection capabilities by species. So it's quite impressive that it's been this successful, and you can see the distance that it's actually capturing them at. Next slide, please. So this is probably my most favorite slide, and we know for sure that these are actually southern resident killer whales. It just so happened that DFO was on the water in the area when this image was captured. So we do know that they were the southern resident. So in summary, you know, the beauty of these is that it's continuous operation, you know, whereas so you're not restricted by daylight because it can pick it up during the day and at night. It's capable of detecting the killer whales through active paths, and we have a detection range of about up to 2 kilometers. And it sort of varies with installation height. When this was being put in, there was discussion as to where the best location of it was, and it was determined that it was going to be over our ramp infrastructure, so it's greater than 10 meters above the actual water height. So it actually is able to provide real-time alerts within 20 seconds, and yeah, it's been a very successful program. It is something that we feel very privileged to be part of. Next slide, please. So the key takeaways for us on this, you know, when I talk about sort of reach in this context, I'm referring to the broader audience. So, for example, if we would have tried to do the Whales in Our Waters online tutorial, you know, by ourselves, it wouldn't have nearly have had the impact, because it would have been something that was restricted to BC Ferries only. By engaging the Port of Vancouver and engaging Oceanwide, we have subject matter expertise, and we have all of these brilliant minds working on this, and then we just are able to have that much greater reach. And that by the Port of Vancouver hosting it on their website, it also becomes accessible to everybody. And I think that is so important. And by engaging these partners, you know, we have a greater visibility. And when it comes to projects itself, you know, for most organizations, there's a lot of competition for funding as it is. So this helps the money go further. And ultimately, the marine mammals, the cetaceans win, and that's what's important. And the last sort of point here is there's also fewer impacts. So we have fewer impacts from less vessels on the water. We have fewer, so underwater radiated noise, as well as emissions overall. And next slide, please. And that's it for me. So it's pretty short and sweet from BC Ferries. So thank you guys very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Leslie, for sharing your experience. I learned quite a few things from your presentation. First time I hear about this thermal imaging technology being used by a ship owner, and I was wondering about that. Is anybody else using that? Is this the first time that a shipping company like BC Ferries is using such a technology?
So, to the best of my knowledge, this pilot was put in place to sort of see if it could become commercially viable. I know that Port of Vancouver has had some discussions, and being that this is a Transport Canada funded project, Michelle might be able to speak a little bit to that as well. But from the ship side, it is quite new, and the cameras themselves are quite expensive. So it's not. We actually looked into this a couple years ago, and the cameras themselves were $150,000 a piece. So wow. When you have a fleet of 37 vessels, it can become quite cost prohibitive very quickly.
Okay, thank you. We have a few questions. So a question from Werner Wilson regarding thermal imaging. Did it detect all marine mammals, or were you able to target just southern resident killer whales?
It actually detected everything. If you go back a few slides, Manon, you can see, so go back to slide number, you can see the detection capabilities by species. You can see it got humpback whales, it got killer whales, it even got some seals, and some porpoises as well. So it actually got quite a bit.
And for thermal cameras, is imaging analysis done by software or requires a trained person to review the image?
Well, it's actually the detections are picked up by an algorithm that was developed by Daniel Zitterbart and Sebastian Richter, who are the principal investigators for this particular project. So this is something that they've developed. And I think that they do truth it just to make sure, because there was some sort of tweaking that was needed to be done initially, but it's gotten quite, it's become quite effective. And I think as it's become more and more refined. Interestingly, we also have a hydrophone at this site. So through the whale tracking network, we have a hydrophone there. So now there's discussions on whether or not they're going to try to like truth, like, you know, because you can tell from that yes, that's a killer whale shape, but you may not know that it is southern resident, or you may not know which pod it is of the southern resident. That's where if they can hear them echolocating, they'll be able to determine that as well in real time.
Maybe I could just add a little bit to that, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
Please.
Okay. Yeah. So, and the initiative that Leslie's speaking about, it's part of the government's Oceans Protection Plan and the whale detection efforts. The kind of identification and testing of different whale detection technology. So the thermal imaging was one of them, infrared technology, different acoustic platforms, both mobile as well as things like gliders and non-mobile platforms that actually move within the water. So this is the intent is to kind of test the effectiveness of this type of technology before deploying it more broadly kind of across different platforms. So working with partners like BC Ferries on the East Coast, we had hoped to have something going this summer with infrared that's had some challenges because of the current pandemic situation, but you know, collaborating with some of the industry representatives there who've offered, you know, vessels to be able to install cameras there as well. So it's a bit of an ongoing effort to test this technology to see what works, what needs to, you know, do the algorithms work, what do they pick up? And it's being led by DFO, by our partners at Fisheries and Oceans, and is kind of part of a broader initiative at testing this different type of platforms that can be used for whale detection.
Thank you for the additional information, Michelle. Two last questions before we move on. Does summer season enables thermal difference between water and individuals?
Sorry, say that again.
Does summer season enables thermal difference between water and individuals? I suppose depending on if you take the measures during winter or during summer, if you get any different type of results.
Well, I'm not the subject matter expert on this, but from what I understand, they're able to detect them. We haven't had any issues all year round. So summer or winter, it doesn't seem to be making a difference.
Okay, and one last question from Lana Hodgson. Can you describe a little more detail of the deltas in the slide detection capabilities by species?
I cannot. Again, this data was actually provided to me from the Daniel Zitterbart. So he could speak to it much better than I can.
Okay, and one last short. Can the resolution also detect pinnipeds? I don't even know what that is, but maybe you do.
Yeah, actually it does. So you can actually see that there's a seal. There's a seal there. So it did. So D there on the bottom right quadrant on this particular slide. So you can see that it did actually pick up some seals.
Okay, so thank you very much, Leslie. We'll go on with our next speakers, who is Hussein Alidina. He has worked for WWF on projects spanning all three of Canada's oceans. In his current role based out of Vancouver, Hussein supports a Pacific Region program to advance marine conservation through tools such as marine protected areas, marine spatial planning, ecosystem-based management, fisheries certification, and climate adaptation. Hussein will discuss WWF-Canada's efforts to increase awareness and action of the issue of underwater noise on the west coast of Canada. We'll also detail the different approaches that WWF-Canada deploys to find solutions in collaboration with other stakeholders. Hussein, the floor is yours.
Thanks, David, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm really pleased to be presenting to you today and through this GreenTech virtual series. So I'm going to speak to you today about some of the role we've played in trying to get collaborative change going, and also want to emphasize that collaboration is a really important thing in our work. To achieve the kinds of conservation goals and outcomes and objectives, it's really impossible to do without collaboration. And what I will be doing through the presentation is profiling the effort of underwater noise and whales, and that effort that we've spent about 10 years in trying to advance. Next slide, please. So just an overview about today's talk. I'll start off by just talking briefly about who we are, WWF Canada, and some of the work we do on shipping. I'll get into this case of underwater noise and whales, this issue we've taken on the last 10 years here in the Pacific. And I'll end with some perspectives on collaborative change and our working through that change and how we've tried to spur action. Next slide. So WWF Canada is part of, is Canada's actually largest international conservation organization. We are part of a large international network that's present in 100 countries, over 100 countries. In Canada, we have offices in St. John's, Halifax, Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, Iqaluit, Yellowknife, and Victoria. I myself actually am now based in Nanaimo. A number of other staff are based in various other places in the country outside the main offices. We have about 150,000+ supporters, Canadians, a membership driven organization. And the main threads of work that we work on are related to wildlife recovery, habitat protection, working on industrial stressors, nature-based climate solutions. And with our geography, we're present working in all 3 of Canada's oceans, in the Arctic, and on freshwater and terrestrial systems. So that's a little bit about WWF Canada. Next slide, please. Just to give you a brief overview of shipping, our shipping work, this is an area of work that has emerged the last few years for WWF Canada, recognizing the need and opportunity to also deal with impacts from shipping on the oceans and the broader environment. So it's a very broad portfolio of work that we're involved in, and I cannot do justice by going through all of this with you here right now, but just to give you an overview of some of the things we're involved in is, major threads of work around reducing pollution, transitioning efforts from HFO to cleaner fuels, working on GHG emissions, changes that reduce pollution, working on oil spill response in the Arctic, for example, directly work on protecting marine wildlife. So, trying to work with partners to develop tools like mariners' guides, really highlighting issues around shipping impacts around wildlife and habitats, supporting primary research, for example, in the area of underwater noise, trying to advance measures that reduce risks from shipping to whales. We also have been involved historically in a lot of marine planning, marine protected areas work, and this is sort of also links to work around shipping corridors or protecting high quality habitat in the vicinity of shipping. So that's a very quick overview of some of the work we're involved in. Certainly, if anyone needs more detail on this or wants to find out more, I'd be happy to connect anyone with my colleagues working on these issues. So next slide. So the approach we use when we work on some of these issues is founded on a bunch of key things. We are science-based, we're informed by science, so a lot of our work will involve good research on social environmental impacts. We have research on the kinds of solutions that could work, the management and policy tools that could be advanced. We obviously do advocacy and outreach with government. WWF has observer status at the IMO. A number of my colleagues in Canada also participate on those delegations to the IMO. we really try and encourage industry leadership on issues. We have outreach with communities, work with a number of them in different areas. And really, you know, to do our work, we need to engage and collaborate. And this is a really important piece of our work. You know, when we work on issues, we really try and work with communities of practice or develop these communities of practice that can advance issues. And I'll talk a little bit about this with underwater noise shortly. You know, we engage with government processes around decision-making and stakeholder initiatives. We work on collaborative initiatives or participate in them. You know, ECHO is a good example. We work with industry partners. We have a number of industry partnerships. An example of a long-standing partnership we've had since 2009 is with CSL. It's work that we're doing together trying to move on GHG reduction. And we really try and engage in dialogues around, you know, understanding, you know, elevating issues, trying to find solutions. So, you know, that's the approach we try and move forward is one that's collaborative and that you know, can achieve practical results. Next slide. So I'm really going to try and take you through some of the work we've been involved with underwater noise, you know, beginning about 10 years ago when we got engaged on this issue and really trying to raise the awareness and try and spur some action. So in 2010, roughly around that time, there was a recognition that this was an emerging issue and one that there was low awareness on, and it provided an opportunity for us to get involved on it. We really looked at the West Coast as a place where we could try and advance some of this awareness building and action. And really that was the start of our work in Canada on underwater noise. We had the good fortune of being advised by people like Michael Jasny and Lance Bert-Leonard, who had been, and Kathy Heisey, who had been working on a number of these issues. And so we really tapped into them to sort of launch some of our work on this. Between 2011 and 2015, we really fostered this broader effort to create awareness, you know, to do some science and assessment work, to have more outreach with industry, with citizen scientists, with communities around this issue and what could be moved forward. And then since 2015, you know, that focused engagement has really turned into working on some really key projects or issues that actually tangibly move into results. And, you know, those are related to some of our work on Southern Residents, obviously our involvement in ECHO, and a project called SWAG in the North Coast that if I have time, I'll briefly talk about. So I'm going to take you through some of the things we did here. Next slide, please. So initially, when we identified this as an issue that needed awareness, one of the things we do when we work on new issues and try and move forward is try and build a community of practice. And really the way in which we did this was, you know, just getting together people to talk about the issue, people who are knowledgeable, who are involved in the issue, who potentially have a role to play. And so we held 2 workshops about a year and a half apart, one in 2012 and one in 2013. And we brought together researchers, policymakers, industry, you know, the port authorities, you know, environmental consultants, citizen scientists, and NGOs. And these were people who were working on these issues or had a interest in them. And really it helped us collectively frame what the issues were, what the needs were, what some of the gaps were, and what some of the medium and long-term actions could be. So this was one way in which, you know, the 2 workshops, one was just around trying to get an understanding of what the issue was in the Pacific. You know, it was called Ocean Noise in Canada Pacific workshop. And the second workshop was really featured around trying to find management solutions to this problem. So these workshops created this loose network of people and awareness among them, and that really sort of you know, help further down the road, you know, with them taking these issues to their organizations, with the engagement that needed to happen further down the road, and so that was the start we made. Next slide, please. Some of the things the workshops revealed was there was a lot of knowledge gaps. There was a need for more coordinated monitoring around these noise baselines. There was a need to really improve assessments of these shipping related developments that were proposed for the coast and the noise levels associated with shipping, and what the associated ecological impacts would be. There was a need for some for management and policy recommendations. There was a recognition that some of these regulatory tools to manage underwater noise were limited, and likely new approaches would be needed. We have the environmental quality guidelines that are part of the Oceans Act, but really haven't been operationalized. We have the Species at Risk Act in Canada that has protections for animals and degradation of their habitat from acoustic noise. But then there's also a need for things like thresholds and noise caps, and these weren't there at the time. There's also recognition that there's many industry and port programs that were at play or were coming into play, and they could be expanded to include underwater noise. There was a recognition of need for industry and public education on this issue. And there was also recognition that there are some actions we could start taking to conserving these quiet areas or trying to reduce where noise is excessive, and that there were processes in play at the time that could incorporate some of this decision making. Next slide. So one of the things we did in 2012 is commission this work, which was really trying to map the noise from shipping, or model the noise from shipping activity on the BC coast. And this, at the time, was the first regional map of underwater noise in Canada from shipping. This is work that was done by Christine Erbe and her colleagues. Christine Erbe was formerly at JASCO and then at Curtin University in Australia. She's a renowned bioacoustician, and she was really able to take shipping data and source levels at the time and develop this model. And what it did do is put out a methodology and approach there to modeling this kind of noise that obviously needed to be ground truthed by hydrophone data, but it did allow for some provision of estimation of what was happening in the environment and where the hotspots were. So you see from this map really the hotspot in the Salish Sea is just how red it is. And this measured what it modeled was cumulative sound exposure levels over a year period. But given the thresholds that were being applied at the time, really most of that area in the Salish Sea would fall in European standards, as poor environmental status because of the level of noise that was there. So right away it flagged to us just how dire the situation was for the southern residents with noise, from this. Now this modeling work obviously got picked up in various other forums by environmental assessments and project proponents who were doing work around shipping and shipping impacts, and got used subsequently, and also was taken up at some point in ECHO, where it was further developed into a regional noise model. But this, just putting this out was one way in which we felt would move the dialogue forward in a practical way. Next slide, please. I'm running out of time and I have a few slides to go to, so I'm just going to rush through some of these other ones. Awareness on this issue was something we tried to do. So fact sheets were some of the things we put out. We also engaged on Parliament Hill with decision makers in something called Ocean. Through the parliamentary caucus, there was Oceans on the Hill events. So there's some ways in which we brought awareness to the issue. Next slide. As we talked and as we gathered information, these were some of the solution spaces that were coming up that I've shown on this slide. There was regulation, there was the need to protect quiet areas. There was a big piece around technology and design in getting more quieter ships and having incentives for innovation and noise reduction. And there was real-time management. How we move this forward really was not something we can really do ourselves. We needed, people who were involved in water to get involved. We need industry to get involved. And so this is when things we needed more engagement for this to happen. Next slide. So 2014 was a bit of a seminal year on this issue. IMO adopted the guidelines for reducing underwater noise from commercial shipping. These are obviously voluntary guidelines, but it did flag to the industry that this was an important issue that needed to be moved forward. Green Marine was an organization we joined in 2013, and we were part of the West Coast Advisory Committee in 2014. Ourselves and others advocated for the development of this underwater noise indicator, and we're really happy that Green Marine took it up in 2014. We participated in with others, obviously, in this initiative. In 2017, they released their indicator underwater noise, which many people are now part of. And the other critical point was the Port of Vancouver launching the ECHO program. Next slide. So Orla has done really well speaking about the ECHO program, so I will not sort of belabor this here, but I just wanted to point out that, when we joined the ECHO program, obviously there was a lot of good conversations that happened to that point to that point with the port, and we were still not sure how this would roll out, but we participated, and as you've seen and as Orla has described, there's been some really significant outcomes that have been achieved here. And I just want to say that there's been drivers on the external side that have really pushed the need for action from ECHO. And in the critical status of southern residents has been one of them. The continued growth of traffic that is coming to the Salish Sea has been another one, and the public expectation to do something on this issue has been a third. And with us being in ECHO, we've really tried to bring some of those voices to the table. One of the things that we've grappled with, and many others in our sort of conservation community have grappled with, is can voluntary actions be meaningful? And I think the reason that question is asked is because there's uncertainty about how permanent these actions will be, how effective those actions will be, and how long they will last. And ECHO has demonstrated that a voluntary program can make can have those gains, can have those quantifiable reductions in threats. So it's heartening to see that these results can be achieved in this way. ECHO has achieved these noise reductions, and there's still a ways to go in terms of other things that need to be done. We know that shipping traffic is going to increase in this area, so this sort of reductions are going to have to be achieved into the future. So I just wanted to say that about ECHO, and it's really been a meaningful program on this coast to be able to move this issue forward. Next slide. I want to point to one other aspect of work that we've really been engaged in that has really tried to turn up the pressure on the external side for action on some of these issues. After many years of recovery planning with the government of Canada on southern residents continue to decline. And the situation for many groups who were involved in these issues got really dire in 2018. And many of our groups, led by Eco Justice and WWF was part of the consortium of groups, really put a petition for an emergency order on southern residents to the government of Canada. And that effort, the petition really asked for immediate actions around reducing threats to southern residents from fishing, so to improve their foraging ability, from other pressures from small vessels, from contaminants, as well as larger issues with disturbance. Now, this obviously caused some difficulty and some concern around what the government might come down with. And it did force the government to reach the finding that the southern residents faced an imminent threat to their survival and recovery. In 2018, we were involved in an effort that launched a federal lawsuit against the failure of the minister to recommend an emergency order. That lawsuit did not proceed because the minister did make a recommendation and it was recommended not to have an emergency order, but to move on a number of other issues. So subsequently, the government moved on a package of measures that moved to prey and small vessels. But this was a way in which we needed to create external pressure for the population, not for shipping, but for food and other issues. Next slide, please. So just to summarize now, as conservation groups, we've really, and the work we've done, really tried to create awareness, raise the public profile of issues, and we can elevate the urgency of action on some of these priority issues. We can collaborate with industry and be part of finding solutions, an essential part of getting outcomes. And when we collaborate with industry in some of these programs, you can be guaranteed the voice we're trying to bring to the table is one for impact, for actions being impactful and lasting. The need for quantifiable threat reduction is something that I'm glad to see ECHO has taken up and is putting into reality. And at times we have to exert this external pressure to drive change. Just as companies have a balance sheet on how they're doing, we need to look at our balance sheet with nature and see, how well we're doing.
Can you conclude, Hussein? We're running out of time.
So thank you. I just next slide, please. And just wanted to wrap up there and say thank you for listening today. Sorry, I went a little bit over, and I just want to acknowledge the people who worked on this, past and present, including our advisors, many of the community of practice, including the working group, and many of our funders and supporters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hussein. Great presentation. This is like a real GreenTech conference. We're running out of time. So, so if you can look at the Q&A box, maybe you can answer some of the questions. We'll go directly to Michelle's presentation to make sure she has time to present her slides. So our last speaker today, certainly it's the last but not the least, Michelle Sanders, Director of Clean Water Policy for Transport Canada. Michelle is responsible for the development and implementation of policy relating to the interaction of vessels and marine mammals, as well as other marine transportation and environmental issues. So Michelle, I will let you start immediately.
Super, thank you. And thanks to Green Marine for making this happen still. I always enjoy the GreenTech conference, so I'm glad we could at least get something together here. So I will jump right in, and as my kind of title slide suggests, I'm taking this away from just the SRKW to actually focus on both coasts. As many of you know, Transport Canada is involved not only on the West Coast with the Southern Resident, but with the vessel interactions on the East Coast with the North Atlantic Right Whale. And I was asked to specifically focus on our collaboration, our transborder collaboration, transboundary, I should say, collaboration with the United States. As one of the kind of particular elements of collaboration and alignment in this kind of a regulatory environment, or rather species protection environment. So if we go to the next slide, please. I'm going to do this, sorry. So this is just a quick overview of the background and kind of where Transport Canada fits into this. As some of you know, or as many of you know, the Whales Initiative was launched in 2018 to kind of bring together the various pieces that the Government of Canada was working on to support the protection and recovery of endangered whales. And this was focused specifically on the threats to the Southern Resident, the North Atlantic Right Whale, and the St. Lawrence Estuary beluga. PC's focus specifically is on mitigating the impacts of vessel traffic, so specifically acoustic and physical disturbance from vessels and the threat of vessel strikes. And we work very closely, I mean, just from a very basic level of collaboration, obviously with our partners at our colleagues at Fisheries and Oceans Canada, who really provide us with the kind of scientific expertise in terms of what the impacts are and the effectiveness of measures. But as the department responsible and having the mandate for safe and environmentally responsible navigation, that's where Transport Canada's role comes in. It is so the mandate that we received was added to, and Hussein alluded to this when the additional measures were announced in October 2018 in response to the finding that the SRKW face imminent threat to survival and recovery, and part of that package of measures that was introduced and commitments that were made was an increase in the cross-border collaboration with US partners to better align and collaborate on initiatives, just given the range of the southern residents. So my focus today is really going to look at the cross-border nature of the issues that we are managing on both coasts, and looking a little bit at how that differs just based on the geography that we're dealing with, as well as the issues that we're dealing with, but all kind of pointing again to the message that is being, I think, driven home through all these presentations about the importance of collaboration across many bodies. We go to the next slide. Very basically, two coasts, two issues. It's really a tale of two coasts, two different whales, two different issues. So if we go to the next slide, let's start with the geography. And Orla showed this slide as well. This shows you what we're looking at in terms of the West Coast with the southern resident. Underwater noise is one of the three key threats to the species. And as you can see from the map, the critical habitat in both Canadian and US waters, so the blue being Canadian waters, the green shaded area is the critical habitat in US waters. And it overlaps directly with the shipping lanes. These are internationally recognized shipping lanes that access the ports kind of in both, Port of Vancouver, Port of Prince Rupert, and kind of up and up to the kind of northern part of, I should say, Nanaimo, up into the Salish Sea. It creates a very huge challenge in terms of being able to kind of mitigate what those risks are. It's also the main shipping, and you can see the same lines with the shipping lanes going down into the Port of Seattle and Port of Tacoma. Further, in terms of just the kind of geography and understanding this and just recognizing the challenge of vessel traffic in this region, Canada and the US actually back in 1969 entered an agreement between the US Coast Guard and the Canadian Coast Guard in terms of how to manage vessel traffic in this area from a safety perspective and emergency response. So it's a vessel traffic, it's a convention on vessel traffic services. And the agreement is that the waters in the Strait of Juan de Fuca will actually be managed by the US Coast Guard, despite the fact that it covers both Canadian and US waters, and the waters in the kind of Harrow Strait Boundary Pass are managed by the Canadian Coast Guard. So this is just kind of, it just highlights the fact that this is such an integrated area where we have to be working together with our US partners to be able to be effective in how we manage the traffic in this area, not only for the large vessels, but obviously the small ones as well. It also just highlights one of the challenges, and therefore one of the things that the ECHO program has really managed to get around, is the fact that the inbound shipping lane all the way up almost to the Port of Vancouver is in US waters. And it might be a little bit hard to see in the map, but that means that we can't actually regulate in US waters and need to be working with our partners on both sides of the border. The outbound lane is, of course, in Canadian waters. In addition to the main shipping routes, this is also an incredibly busy area on the water, and the regular cross-border activity by pleasure craft, by ferries, by whale watching vessels, I mean, it's back and forth and it's seamless. And it just highlights, I mean, you've got people, kind of in that northern corner of the map who, walk across the street and they could be in Canada. And so it just really highlights the importance of understanding and aligning as much as possible and coordinating what the regulations are. We go to the next slide. Then we move over to the East Coast. The geography is a little simpler, I would say, and only because it's more of a standard north-south border where you don't have that kind of divide going up the shipping lane, kind of with the, you can't on the other, but where going into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, you're in water. So that does facilitate things a little bit. However, it doesn't. North Atlantic right whale, which is an endangered species numbering around 410 at this point. Its range goes from the Gulf all the way down the seaboard. This map kind of shows the Canadian water since 2017, and it's largely in the summer months that we see this. And this is from whale map through the Dalhousie University. Way into the Gulf of St. Lawrence is through Cabot Strait, and you can see the ship in Cabot Strait. It's kind of the, well, you can see it between Newfoundland and Nova Scotia and Cape Breton. There is where that main migratory pattern of the North Atlantic right whale. So we go to the next slide. That just kind of gives you a sense of geography. And then we have to look at the issues. So we have two different geographies. We have two different issues we're looking at. On the West Coast, we're talking primarily about underwater noise when it comes to the southern resident. Easy formula that will allow us to determine how quiet we need to make it. The way the sound propagates will vary depending on the season, the weather, the type of vessel. Not all vessels sound the same. Not all vessels respond the same way. So for example, slowing down some ferries, for example, actually makes them louder due to the variable pitch propellers. So a slowdown is not a silver bullet. So we need to really be looking at what the different solutions are for different circumstances and different vessels. So it's quite a complex issue to try to tackle. When we look at vessel strikes, which is the primary threat we're looking at on the East Coast, while some of the responses are similar, a slowdown reduces the risk of a lethal strike, a slowdown generally reduces underwater noise from vessels, issues are quite different. And I'd say with strikes, the solutions are a little bit more limited. It's avoid interaction between whales and vessels or slow them down. And so it's a bit of a different approach and a different set of issues that we have to think about, obviously not least of which is safety of the vessel and of the crew. The critical piece for strikes really, and not that it's any less critical for noise, but I'd say specifically with strikes, is knowing exactly where the whales are and when, so that boaters can ensure they avoid them. So it's a bit of a different type of threat that, I mean, the minute obviously there is a strike, there is that the whale will be injured and potentially could be a lethal strike. So it just adds a different level of consideration that you have to think about, and how do you collaborate across border to ensure that you have the data and the information you need. So despite these differences though, there's one common principle that obviously guides Canada's actions, which is collaboration. If we go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about how these differences affect that cross-border collaboration and dig into a little bit. But if we go to the next slide, there are some kind of two primary objectives that are consistent across Canada's approach to collaboration and what we're trying to achieve with alignment as much as possible. The first is that obviously we need to collaborate to provide the optimal protection for the species. So regardless of where it is found in its range, you know, if Canada does everything in its power to reduce the risks in our water, it doesn't change the fact that outside of the summer months, both of these species spend a good amount of their time in US waters. So if we really want to be successful, we need to ensure that the entire range of the species is being addressed in a cohesive way, and that the threats are being addressed across its range. The second issue is to facilitate implementation, whether it's a voluntary or mandatory measure. If you're a vessel, you know, especially a large commercial vessel that's going from Singapore to Vancouver to Long Beach, you know, understanding what the rules and the requirements are in different waters is really important. And so the more we can be consistent with how we're approaching things to facilitate, so they know, right, when I'm, you know, once I hit the west coast of Canada, in these two areas, I have to go whatever that speed is, or you know, knowing or recognizing that there's a slowdown in those areas. So it just kind of helps to facilitate the implementation and the participation, especially if they're voluntary initiatives. The other critical thing with transboundary collaboration, and which is really important to achieving the objectives that I just spoke to, is around the shared understanding of science. So obviously everybody's got their own limited resources in terms of research, and the more that we can learn from each other to share data, to collaborate on effectiveness monitoring, the better we all are in being able to properly scope and define, inform, and implement measures that will achieve the objective of reducing the threat to the species. So both Canada and the US are really aligned on this and on the need for that long-term strategic plan that will help mitigate the threats to the survival and recovery of southern residents. And I would say, while as much as we are aligned, our protections obviously will take into account our respective legislative and rulemaking processes, as well as stakeholder perspectives. So that's always a consideration on top of it. It's not as easy just to say, you know, do what the US does or do what Canada does, because we might have different regulatory tools or levers that they don't have, or vice versa. So this is always one of the considerations that we have to understand as we work through this. It also doesn't automatically mean that there's going to be, you know, exact mandatory measures in both countries, but rather, and I think the ECHO program is really a perfect example of that, where the success of that transboundary voluntary efforts. How do we work together to put in place a program that will reduce the threat by working together? Because we might not have the, you know, the regulatory tool, or a regulatory tool might not be the right one. So if we go to the next slide, one of the things I think with Southern resident in particular that makes it a little bit of an interesting, or more challenging, I'm going to say, situation, and really highlights the importance of the transboundary collaboration, is exactly what I just said, is because the location of the border results in so much more back and forth traffic between the two countries on a daily basis. The integrated approach is really important. And obviously the ECHO program is a really good example of that. But there are a number of other initiatives that we have been, that Transport and my other government colleagues have been really working hard to establish those bilateral relationships on a government-to-government basis, so that we can figure out where those levers are and how we can collaborate. So, you know, this occurs through bilateral meetings, informal discussions. Government of Canada was involved in the Washington State Orca Task Force, the Vessel Working Group, as well as the one on contaminants and prey. US partners are involved in the Indigenous and Multi-Stakeholder Advisor Group that Canada has, and the technical working groups. And then we have the Be Whale-Wise Partnership, which is a collaboration of both government and non-government entities from both Washington State, Canada, US, non-government government, that are working together to really put those out. So it's a continued, our continued work with US partners is really about, you know, exchanging information, lessons learned from our respective efforts, and how do we align as much as possible. We go to the next slide. I'm running out of time quickly. This is just a little bit shows kind of what that collaboration can result in. Don't need to really go into the ECHO program. I think that's been sufficiently identified or explained as a really good example. The other is just the measures that we've announced. We just announced our second year of enhanced measures in Canadian waters, including the 400-meter approach distance in the interim sanctuary zones. NOAA and US partners were part of that effort to help, especially from an education and outreach, and to kind of align with efforts underway there. If we go to the next slide, quickly, just on the North Atlantic right whale, it's a little bit simpler, no less important, but the focus here is really about learning from each other. You know, prior to 2017, we did not have the whale presence that we have, North Atlantic right whale presence that we have in the Gulf. The US had taken significant efforts, because that's where its main habitat happened to be. So when we encountered the situation in 2017 in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, we really looked to what they had put in place to learn from them, and to work with them on how they approached it, what lessons they learned, so on and so forth. So if we go to the next slide, this just kind of gives you a sense of you know, how that learning worked. We have regular bilateral meetings with them, where we both share our science, we share the information we have in terms of understanding the distribution and the patterns and the impacts of climate change on prey availability and different issues like this in terms of the migration patterns, so that we can both learn and adapt using the tools we have, but aligning as much as possible. I'd be remiss, I'm not going to go into this. Hussein kind of mentioned quickly, but obviously international collaboration with partners is equally essential, especially just given on the issue of underwater noise. And this is something that Canada continues to advance with other countries around the world because of the global issue, global aspect of shipping and underwater noise. If we go to the next slide, oh, sorry, last slide. So just in closing, go to the last slide, the next one. There we go. You know, and this was really focusing, and I kind of flew through this on collaboration with US partners, but really to really be effective in implementing measures to protect these species on both coasts, it requires collaboration, not only from U.S. partners and government partners, but marine stakeholders, indigenous groups, environmental organizations, scientists, international partners. And I think that's been sufficiently highlighted in the different presentations today. And working together, I think we can, support effective measures for the survival and recovery of the species. So thank you.
That's it. Thank you very much, Michelle. I hope you didn't feel too rushed. Sorry that we're running out of time. And I don't think anybody has a plane to catch, so I think it's okay if we go over by 5 minutes. We can take 1, 2, or maximum 3 questions, but I have a $1 million question for you here. So the question is, will underwater noise be regulated for Canadian water in the longer horizon, 10 to 20 years from now? Can you answer that, Michelle?
I wish I had a crystal ball. I think what we can say is that, as long as it is a threat to the species, it will be something that we will be working on. And it is one of 3 main threats to the southern resident, with only 72 remaining. So I don't see this being an issue that's going away anytime soon. It's also a threat to many other species. The St. Lawrence Estuary beluga, we didn't talk about it. It doesn't cross borders, so I didn't talk about it in that sense, but it is a species within Canadian waters that is equally affected by underwater noise. There's also 130 species globally that are affected by underwater noise, and just given the inherent global nature of shipping, I think it's something that is going to be necessary for long-term action to be able to reduce the soundscape on a global scale.
Maybe one last question. It's a west versus east type of question. So about the belugas in the east, there are these huge initiatives with the ECHO program in the west. So what are the Canadian government plans to have a kind of equivalent treatment in the Eastern Canada?
Specifically for the beluga, so there is work being done for the beluga. So I know I didn't speak to that specifically, but we are working closely with our colleagues in Parks Canada, and there's a somewhat similar, but not, to the ECHO program. And I can tell you the French acronym, and I don't think I ever get it right, but it's G2T3M.
Hey, you got it right.
I know the acronym, but don't ask me to actually state what that actually means. C'est un groupe de travail de protection de marines mammifères, quelque chose comme ça, je crois. And it's the same idea where it's bringing together industry partners, researchers, environmental organizations, and government entities to identify and to implement measures to reduce underwater noise and the effects on the beluga. So there are, the marine mammal regulations does set a minimum approach distance for the beluga. There was a trial last year in BC Ferries in the Saguenay to look at a no-go zone for vessels, as well as a slowdown in the area. So a number of similar initiatives that are being implemented and trialed on the East Coast to better protect the beluga both within the park, because it is the primary habitat is in the Parc de Saguenay, which is a national park. But then also in the waters just kind of outside of that and throughout its range. So it is a priority and one of the 3 species that we are working on through the Whales Initiative. This doesn't necessarily have that same cross-border issue because its critical habitat is not in U.S. waters in any way.
Okay, thank you very much once again, Michelle. So we'll wrap this up. This concludes our first session for this Virtual GreenTech webinar series. So I hope you enjoyed the experience. Many thanks to our 4 speakers for accepting to share your knowledge and to be our guinea pigs with this first webinar. We'll get better with time management. And once again, many thanks to all of our sponsors. Don't miss our other webinars in June. We hope to see you again in great numbers on Thursday next week at 2 p.m. Eastern Time for our next session. We'll have speakers from Maersk, DNVGL, and Wärtsilä to explore different options to reduce vessels' carbon footprint. The session will be moderated by Eleanor Kirtley, our Senior Program Manager. So visit our website for more information or to register. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you again to our panelists, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thanks, David. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.